In Giorgio Agamben's lesser known text, Man and Animal, he explores a lot of the theological and political ideas which surround man's relation and distinction to animality. Some typical questions we could bring up in this context would be, is man sort of irreparably alienated from his animal nature? Is man a synthesis of higher spiritual nature and animal nature? Uh, is our animal nature and our spiritual nature, our kind of human cultural nature, reconcilable in some sense? These are a few of the questions which we're going to encounter in any kind of philosophical or anthropological inquiry into the tension, distinction between man and animal. How has our understanding of this distinction, tension, or potential for reconciliation between man and animal, how has this understanding affected our ethical, political, and social history? Without doing a detailed breakdown of the entire book, I just want to focus in on one particularly interesting section in which Agamben brings us through a tension disagreement between the Hegelian philosopher Alexander Coevy and the French philosopher Georges Bataille. One of the most interesting questions which Agamben brings up in this passage relates to the end of history and the how the end of history has affected our understanding of ourselves as man, as being distinct from animal. So Agamben writes, one of the central issues of Gohevy's lectures on Hegel, which Bataille attended, was the problem of the end of history and the figure that man and nature would assume in the post-historical world, when the patient process of work and negation by means of which the animal of the species of Homo sapiens had become human reached completion. In one of his characteristic gestures, Coevy dedicates to this problem only a footnote. So here's the direct quote from Coevy. The disappearance of man at the end of history is not a cosmic catastrophe. The natural world remains what it has been for all eternity. And it is not a biological catastrophe either. Man remains alive as animal in harmony with nature or given being. What disappears is man properly so called, that is, action negating the given, and error, or in general the subject opposed to the object. In point of fact, the end of human time or history, that is, the definitive annihilation of man properly so called, or of the free and historical individual, means quite simply the cessation of action in the strong sense of the term. Practically, this means the disappearance of wars and bloody revolutions, and the disappearance of philosophy, for since man no longer changes himself essentially, there is no longer any reason to change the true principles which are at the basis of his knowledge of the world and of himself. But all the rest can be preserved indefinitely. Art, love, play, etc., etc. In short, everything that makes man happy. So, a few notes on this passage from Coevy before I go more into Agamben's interpretation. Um, this is this is basically this fundamental question of the end of history, and you see it in Fukuyama if you read the last few sections of Fukuyama's text, The End of History, particularly when he talks about the last man. And this is a kind of fundamental concern of the end of history. And the end of history isn't this complete catastrophe, the end of human life, the end of all life, the end of any sort of, I don't know, meaning, even the end of um, um, everything. It's a specific end of something essentially human, and it's specifically the end of the thing which is essentially human, which ironically is the violent thing. It's the thing which is willing to go to the end, to die, to sacrifice, to bleed for um, for history, basically. In these Hegelian terms, the battle over recognition, which is what Fukuyama calls more megalothymotic, in the sense that it's an extreme desire for recognition. It's a kind of radical desire for recognition. This is gradually replaced by what he calls isothymia, which is a moderate desire for recognition. So the extreme desire for recognition, which ends up in violent conflict, not exclusively, but a lot of the time, um, is replaced by the kind of work and negation of the more moderate isothymia. Now, I actually think that the end of history has created a new category of thymotic desire for recognition, which is no longer the megalo, no longer the iso, and it's something which is not even moderate. Um, it's sort of like if you were like fast food recognition or something. It's a kind of depraved, um, um, perverted form of recognition, which can't even be mapped onto the moderate desire for recognition. It's something in its entire category, entirely different category, which we haven't really identified yet. So it's not necessarily the case, as we see with this kind of typical image of the last man, of this person who just like is completely nihilistic, like he kind of sits around like just watching TV or something. He's like completely without motivation. He's completely without meaning or purpose or direction in any sense of the word. I do think that this is perhaps one expression of the end of history and the last man, but it's not the only one, and it's perhaps even less dangerous of a expression of it because it's kind of obvious. Um, there's this question of these things which make us human, love, play, art, and so forth. These things remain. These things remain once history proper is over, and once man has lost his desire for recognition in the more radical sense, and I would also sort of argue in the moderate sense, but nonetheless, once that that historical drive for recognition is over, it's not necessarily that we become, I don't know, like these cliched images of last men. We still want our we still want things which make us human. We still want love, play, art. We want things which make us happy, as Gohevi writes. The association of this with the natural world, I think, is important. That in a sense, human beings, once they no longer have this desire for more extreme recognition, they still, in a sense, want meaning. They still, in a sense, want happiness, and they want things which define them as human. Perhaps here we could formulate a critique of humanism, because I think humanism is very much in this category. It's very much something which wants to celebrate and assert something essentially human, but it's this essentiality is no longer tied to its more extreme historical activity. It's also worth noting that if Aristotle said man is a political animal, I think we could say the post-historical man is a happy animal. I think this is a very good choice of words from Gohevi here, because what we've done, I think, in particularly the kind of late capitalistic post-historical world, is that we've basically replaced politics and religion with things which sort of make us happy. Perhaps they don't really make us happy, but at least in some short term sense, in some immediate sense, in some perhaps illusory sense, they do. I mean, you can think of, consumption, high living standards, consumption, modern medicine, the therapeutic culture. It's probably a very good example. All these mechanisms we have, which give us some sort of happiness, but this happiness is stripped from something which used to, in historical terms, Man. So those are just some of my initial thoughts on that passage, but I'll keep reading Agamben's words here. Agamben then says the disagreement between Bataille and Kohefi concerns just that resto, that survives the death of man, who has become animal again at the end of history. What the pupil, who was in fact 5 years older than the teacher, could not accept at any cost was that art, love, play, as well as laughter, ecstasy, luxury, ceased to be superhuman, negative, and sacred, in order simply to be given back to animal praxis. End quote. So, Bataille, in this dispute, which Agamben is outlining, was sort of shocked by this, and he said, in simple terms, but wait a minute. If this is the case, if the history can end and man's struggle for kind of radical recognition and those properly essentially human forces give up, and we still have art, love, play, luxury, things which are essentially things which are human, this is almost worse. Right, this is why this passage, this is why this chapter stood out to me, because this is almost worse than if we just stopped having art and play and these human things, right? These human practices and human things. If we have these things, but these things are in a sense separated from negativity, sacredness, and therefore they sort of just regress into mere animal praxis, which is the choice of words which Agamben chooses here. These things become animal praxis. They make us happy. They give us some sort of, I don't know what, comfort, distraction. These are, somewhat disregarding terms. Maybe there's more complementary terms. I don't know. But you see what the problem is. You see the dilemma here. Once we strip these human traits and these human practices from their essentially historical and their kind of radical negativity and their radical sacredness, what are we left over with? What becomes of these things? I was reminded, just as another kind of side note, I was reminded here a little bit of Mark Fisher and the end of history and capitalist realism and his observation about music. And he saw the end of history not just as, for example, a unipolar geopolitical order, or there being no kind of coherent potential kind of ideological political contest to liberalism, but he really kind of understood this end of history problem through this hauntological concept where we could no longer create art in the same sense in which historical people could create art. Our art becomes a kind of repetitive, hauntological practice. It loses something essential about it. It loses a distinct historical character. I think this is one of the points that Mark Fisher made, was that basically the end of history, it kind of got trapped in the 80s and 90s. All art became trapped within that era, and some sort of creative potentiality just sort of completely went out, and then you're left with this. I think you're left with what is called kishk. For something to be kishk, I might be mispronouncing that, but I'm going to Google this right now. Quiche. No, okay. See, if you Google quiche, you get an ad for a company trying to sell you kitchenware. Okay. Quiche is a term to art and design that is perceived as naive imitation, gratuitous, or banal. So you end up replacing art with quiche, and that is, I think, essentially this in this theoretical context that we're discussing here is basically the having these human practices as things which make us happy rather than things which contain radical negativity and radical sacredness. Okay, so let's keep reading. Agamben says, of course, at issue here was also the interpretation of Hegel, a terrain in which Gohevy's authority was particularly threatening. If history is nothing but the patient dialectical work of negation, and man both the subject and the stakes in his negating action, then the completion of history necessarily entails the end of man, and the face of the wise man who, on the threshold of time, contemplates this end with satisfaction, necessarily fades, as in the miniature in the Ambrosian, into an animal snout. That's a reference to the introduction, which talks about kind of mysticism and Jewish Kabbalah interpretations of I think he said the reconciliation between man and animal through a kind of messianic vision of the world, something like this. Anyway, that's the first section. So if you read this book, these references make sense if you read the first section. They don't really make sense to me still, but whatever. Anyway, so he says, for this reason, in a letter to Gohevy on December 6th, 1937, Bataille has to wager on the idea of a negativity with no use. Also, an unemployed negativity. I love this term. This is brilliant. An unemployed negativity. Or maybe the unemployed Übermensch, right? That is, of a negativity that somehow survives the end of history and for which he can provide no proof other than his own life, the open wound that is my life. I grant, so this is Bataille, in a letter to him, this is Bataille. I grant as a likely supposition that from now on history is concluded, except for the epilogue. Interesting way of putting that. Okay, I continue. However, I picture things differently. If action, doing, is, as Hegel says, negativity, the question arises whether the negativity of one who has nothing more to do disappears or remains in a state of negativity with no use. Personally, I can only decide in one way, being myself precisely this negativity with no use. So Bataille is there saying he is kind of a good example of this negativity with no use. I would not be able to define myself more precisely. I recognize that Hegel has foreseen such a possibility. At any rate, he didn't situate it at the end of the process he described. I imagined that my life, or better yet, its aborting, the open wound that is my life, constitutes all by itself the refutation of Hegel's closed system. End quote. Okay, I've never read Bataille before. I kind of literally heard the name a few times, never read him, don't know much about him. But clearly a smart guy, because this is a really interesting framework. This idea of a negativity with no use, I think, is a absolutely brilliant idea. And we reach the end of history. We have, in some sense, we have a remainder. History is over in some sense, but there's this remainder. What remains, right? This kind of brings us into this question of like, human beings are still human beings, right? I mean, I'm genetically very similar. Well, okay, I won't use myself as a comparison. My manager at work, who's a complete last man, he's genetically a human, and Alexander the Great was genetically a human. Make sense of that, right? Okay, so what remains in some sense is humanity. Is this bare life humanity that I'm discussing? Maybe. But in some sense, what remains is humanity, and humans don't necessarily, at the end of history, turn into animals in the simple sense of they no longer have art, they no longer have play, they no longer have leisure, they no longer have economics, they no longer have science, they no longer live in houses, they start living in the wild. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not, this is the, again, to put something in its hauntological framework. I think that might be a good way of doing this. And as you can probably tell, I'm thinking about this on the spot. Like, I don't really have a plan of thinking about this, so this is all on the spot. But hauntological thinking is that something remains, right? So the spirit remains when the body is gone. A house that is haunted, the people are physically not there, but something remains. There's this remainder. So the end of history really is a time where there's this remainder, this kind of elephant in the room, you can nearly say, um, that constantly has no place. It's unemployed. A ghost that haunts a house doesn't belong to the house either. A ghost is it's a kind of unemployed person in a kind of sense, in a kind of like literal sense, in an ontological sense. Um, the people who have negativity with no use, and I would definitely fit myself into that category, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening would fit themselves into that category too. What are they? What did they do? What does their life mean now in this end of history time? And as Bataille says, he is therefore, I think, unlike Gohevi, I think Gohevi kind of I'm not an expert on Gohevi, but I feel like he accepted the end of history more, and Bataille here is playing the role of the person he's resisting, he's not accepting the end of history. He's acknowledging its historical reality, but he's not kind of ethically and politically succumbing to its supposed legitimacy, we could say. I think what Agamben is doing here quite well is that he's framing the end of history as its own peculiar regression to being an animal. It's a kind of peculiar regression to animality. This unemployed negativity. What is this thing that is unemployed? What is this thing which is haunting us? Well, it's ironically the thing that has historically made us human, right? And you can see this if you look at the psychopolitical situation of the end of history that we still live in. The geopolitical situation is changing, and I think even the domestic political situation is in the process of changing. But I think psychopolitically we're very much in the end of history, because what is contained in this unemployed negativity, which Bataille is talking about? Well, it's kind of radical courage, it's radical spirit, it's maybe radical love in some extreme sense. It's in Hegelian terms, the development of a self-consciousness which is willing to go to the end for its own self-consciousness and so forth. This thing which has made us human is now the thing which is unemployed, right? It's a really strange situation. And all of the things which employ us, I mean, the word employed, I mean, literally has an economic has an economic meaning here. The things which motivate us, the things which we do on a day-to-day basis, the things which now structure our social relations. This is all like gay. You know what I mean? It's all just like self-preservation and consumption. It's the appetite of, if you were to use a classical psychology, it would be the appetite of, and the acquisitional, and the kind of self-preserving, lower, more base motivations. These are the things which are employed, and the radical negativity which has made us human, so far historically, is now the thing which is unemployed. It's a complete reversal from history in that sense. Now, I'm not 100% on what Agamben's kind of concrete thoughts are here, because the book, this is like the second section in the book, and the book goes on for much more sections, and I haven't read all of them yet, so I'm not sure. But I think this certainly does highlight something. The end of history does certainly highlight something about our relationship to our own humanity as being distinct from animals and so forth, in the sense that in history we could say, history proper, man is motivated and employed by his most human motivations. His humanity is kind of radically distinct and radically human. And the end of history happens, we don't turn into animals in the simple sense of like, we give up on human practices. Like anthropologically, we're no longer animals. Like we return to hunter-gatherer societies or something like this, right? It's not this kind of concrete, transparent regression to an animal state. We lose our distinction from animality in from animals in some sense. We lose our radical humanity, but we don't live as animals. We retain human practices like play, art, love, leisure, and so on and so forth. So, like, what weird ontological position are we now? Like, we're not humans in the full sense. We're not totally regressing into animals. Like, what's our ontological status in the end of history? I think Nietzsche would say like farm animals or something, right? Like kind of domestic animals, you know, something which is not a radical expression of spirit, but is also not a total expression of nature either. It's this kind of civilized animality, we could nearly say. There's a lot of different routes we could go down here. Fukuyama, for example, I think, just to speak less of the animal idea, but of the concept of thymos and the loss of the megalothymia, the excessive desire for recognition. Fukuyama actually quite honestly addresses this in The End of History and The Last Man, at least in the final few chapters. And one of the big questions, of course, is like, because we're humans, the more extreme megalothymotic desire will, of course, still exist. I think he used Donald Trump actually as an example of this, but this was written in the 90s, of course. So at the time, Donald Trump wasn't the Donald Trump we know of today. But Fukuyama's sort of contemplation on this was something like, will that excessive desire for recognition be able to find an acceptable place within an essentially isothymotic or a kind of moderate thymotic or a kind of post-historical world? Like if our social relations, our economics, our politics, our institutions are all governed by kind of post-historical motivations, which means they're not motivated and governed and directed around and towards the excessive, higher, radically human motivations of history, but they're directed around, security, comfort, self-preservation, distraction, entertainment, and so on and so on and so on. If this whole world is like kind of sociologically, economically, and politically, we could say, and psychologically geared towards last men, like, but radical thymotic drive, megalothymia will remain. Like, what will be the kind of tension between the people who embody the megalothymia and the people who are, and like the rest of society? What will be that tension? What will that tension look like? And will there be a conflict there? And who will win? And I think Fukuyama kind of made the success of liberalism not contingent on, I think he's misunderstood in this regard, not contingent on, for example, getting rid of megalothymia. Like you have to get rid of people like, Napoleon or something. It was more, can their kind of ethical, psychological drives, their desires, can those, and their ambitions and their self-consciousness, can those be integrated into the more moderate post-historical liberal order in an acceptable way, in which they don't just like all kill themselves or like go to war against the rest of us or something? Like is there some acceptable kind of negotiation between the megalos and the ISOs. I think that's kind of actually a very good framework to think about whether or not liberalism could be successful. And I think at the time anyway, probably to this day, Fukuyama was more optimistic. He thought that it was possible, although he did ask the question quite honestly, which showed that he wasn't 100% sure. But nonetheless, I think that if you know, for example, if you're more like Bataille or myself, for example, and if you kind of question whether liberalism has the capacity to to integrate megalothymia into a post-historical society, um, then liberalism starts to not look so hopeful. And we could put it another way within the context of animality and humanity. We could put it like this. We could say, if the thing which makes us human, the radical negativity, no longer has a kind of historical place in the larger social order, can it still exist enough to give us a sense of humanity as being distinct from animals? Or will its historical unemployment, this unemployed negativity, be such a kind of catastrophe in itself that the larger social order and the larger kind of subjectivity of society will basically gradually regress into a animal state, maybe not like the animal state of living in the woods, but an ambiguous sort of, to use the controversial term, maybe subhumanity even. What will be the ontological status if we are no longer led by radical negativity and we are no longer led by the sacred or the radical expression of humanity? What will be the ontological status of the larger social order if that's the case? And I think it's a good question, and I don't think you're going to find a very nice answer if you ask that question honestly. But that's just my thoughts on that. So thank you for listening to this little rant.